Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special bonus episode. We have with us for today's bonus episode the author of the book called The Art of Slicing Work. And his name is Anton Skornyakov. Hey, Anton, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Vasco.
So Anton is the co-founder and managing director at Agile.coach, where he has coached nearly hundreds of organizations and thousands of people in the art of slicing work. His new book, The Art of Slicing Work, represents the sum total of all the stories, lessons, and principles he's collected over his career. And of course, we are going to dive into that. Slicing work has been one of the topics that I have talked a lot about in my own work. And I do believe it is a critical art to master, picking on the title of the book. So Anton, tell us, what inspired you to write this book? What were the things you were seeing in your work that trigger you to discover the strategies and ultimately to make you decide write this book?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I work with organizations and individuals that deal with a fair amount of surprises and unpredictability. And typically there is a lot of different questions in such organizations, such as who should be doing what, who should belong to which team, who should be responsible for something, how to deal with different opinions on this and that, and so forth. And in my experience, these questions are important, and just discussing them very often leads to theoretical discussions that are not pragmatic and not really helpful. These questions are often kind of secondary. The primary question is, what is the result that we are going to deliver that is going to help us learn something or deliver any kind of value? And when I ask this question, very often the first answer is not really something that you or I would agree that is valuable or is helpful to learn anything for the real product. It would be a concept or a design document or many other things that are just intermediary. But when we get to this point, when we actually see little results that are capable of giving us some learning or value, our discussions of those other questions, like who should be doing what and what is responsible, all those discussions, they immediately become very pragmatic. We find answers that are useful for us in this particular situation, and maybe in another situation they won't be as useful. But for this particular situation, we find pragmatic answers, and we have an agreement between all the different levels in the organization, because the stakeholders are actually interested in what is valuable. The developers actually then can contribute to something that is valuable. And so this is kind of, to me, this is the question and this art that is capable of bringing together everyone in the organizations from very, very different needs and focuses and perspectives.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that in your experience, very often the important questions that people are asking in the organizations kind of stay too high level, maybe too fuzzy, because we're not really focusing on something concrete. Is that what you're trying to communicate?
So typically the questions of, who should be doing what, or whose responsibility should be this or that, is in and of itself a very theoretical question, and can be discussed a long time.
Yeah.
However,
there's no single answer to that.
And there is no single answer, yes, and we can go very deep in this theoretical discussion, which is really not useful for the organization at hand. But when we know, so our mission is in the next 2 weeks to deliver this particular result, very often the answer is just immediately obvious. So right, for the next two weeks, this is what makes sense. And then we don't waste time on discussing a theoretical question.
Yeah. So the focus on the immediate delivery, I guess, is what you're referring to, right? Like when you say 2 weeks, I'm guessing you're talking about like a sprint goal and a delivery that is coming up.
It could be anything. It could be and this is maybe important to say about the book. I very often deal with people who are not from the software, who are coming from government agencies or nonprofit departments. And when we start talking using our normal jargon, the Scrum language or the technical language, these people get lost. But they can really understand what it means to deliver something of value and start distinguishing between which kind of delivery is actually providing me with any valuable learning and which is not. That's something that is completely unique and completely independent of industries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess this is also why we talk about slicing work being so important, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe we could do that next. Let's walk through an example so that the people listening will know how this applies to their work. So we're talking about focusing on shorter term, on concrete objectives. And in the first chapter of the book, you introduce that concept, the slicing work. So let's walk through an example. How does that conversation look like when we start slicing work?
Yeah, as you say, in the first chapter, I just use a very simple example of work that most people are familiar with, is basically preparing a large dinner for a lot of guests. And if you put yourself into the situation where you have to prepare a meal for, let's say 20 guests, and how you can divide up the work that is in front of you. You can divide it into a list of, say, first of all, you think about the entrees, then you think about main courses, then you think about the desserts, and then you think what guests will come. Some of them do not eat meat. Some of them are even vegans. So what kind of dishes will I offer them for the entrees, for the main courses, and for the desserts? And the individual dishes you will write down, and that's going to be your menu. What I've just done was a very simple example of slicing the work of delivering this whole dinner vertically. We divided it up in small dishes that are all tasteable, and someone can put them into their mouth and say whether they like it or not. Or you can divide this whole dinner preparation in a large list of to-dos. The different vegetables that you want to wash and peel and cut, how you want to season the different courses, how you want to preheat the oven for a couple of dishes and then put things in there, and keep them there for a couple of minutes and then put them out, and so forth. And this second division of work would be a division of work in different actions. And this is something that is horizontal. And both lists have their meaning and have their value. Both kind of separation of work, horizontal and vertical, have their meaning. And we often do not, separate them consciously. So basically, we talk about things like which of the lists gives you an overview of what's going to be on the table. It's kind of obvious. It's the list of the dishes. Which list will help you change the scope of your dinner if you have to deal with your kids for 2 hours and don't have as much time as you planned for to actually prepare it? Well, you cannot just omit preheating the oven. That doesn't make sense. So you will use this vertical list of dishes if you want to change the scope. Then there is an interesting question of responsibility. What happens if you delegate to someone who is helping you prepare this dinner to you ask them, well, would you create those baked potatoes for me, please? This is something you can do with someone who can bake potatoes on their own, and then they will kind of own the whole task. But what if you do it with your kids? Like, well, my kids are 8 and 10 years old. If I ask them to do the baked potatoes, I'm not so sure the result's going to be good, right? So what I would ask them is, I guess, to peel the potatoes. That's a horizontal task. Now, the interesting part is now, what are they responsible for and what am I checking? So if I ask someone to peel the potatoes, what I'm checking is whether the potato is peeled well. Now, everyone can do that. It's not a difficult task. But in organizations, horizontal tasks are like program an API, change the backend so that the API can respond to something, or program the front end. in order to check a horizontal task, I need to be an expert in this horizontal task. And typically, as a product owner, for example, I'm not. I cannot check whether the code is done well. And that's actually not something that I'm interested in. And then there is this typical thing of, I'm not sure whether you can relate to this, but for me, like when my partner asks me, could you please slice the tomatoes? I would ask, well, how thin do you want them? Right? And then she'll say, well, how thin do you like them? How thin do you like them in this dish? Right? And this little conversation shows what's happening with responsibility there, right? When I'm asked to just slice the tomato, I will just look at the tomato and just, this is going to be my work. Right? When I think about the whole dish instead of that, I'm automatically invited to take ownership of the whole thing.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. The ownership is, but before we go into that, there's another point that you brought up, which is this separate perspective on the work. So slicing it vertically, as you were saying, or slicing it horizontally by task that is not self-contained, meaning that there's no value in that task unless you complete other tasks. This has a tremendous impact on how we see work. So you gave the example of, if I don't trust my kids to be able to boil the potatoes, I'm going to break that task even further down and give them a smaller part of the overall boil the potatoes task. Or in the case of a front end, back end, if you have a back end expert, you're not going to ask them to design the front end because it would probably look very ugly. But it changes how we relate to the work immediately, right? So, for example, in the front end, back end, a very simple example is that the back end engineer does all of the work that they were asked to do, but the front end engineer doesn't have a way to relate to the back end implementation. They are talking different languages, right? Like the front end might be talking about user-centric tasks, and the back end is thinking about micro updates to a database, right? They are not even relatable to each other. So what I'm also hearing from you, and I don't know if that's what you mean, but definitely it is my experience, is that when we break the work horizontally, we end up with very competent work that is not connected to other competent work that needs to be connected to. Is that also what you're trying to say?
Yes, and I'm trying to make a statement that what we want to discuss in organizations is the vertical part. We definitely do need the separation of the back-end work and front-end work and whatever other expertises are there. This is a necessary thing when it comes to self-organization of a team. But what I want to request from a team, what I want to judge a team's performance on, what I want to see in my organization and discuss are not those back-end or front-end tasks. What I want is a lot of small, actually verifiable results, things that we can, check and show to other people, and they can try it out and taste and tell us whether the dish is tasting well or not.
Yeah, so this is very important. So you say, what I want is to discuss something that is tastable, or let's call it potentially shippable, which is the Scrum terminology. Okay, cool. But what role are you taking when you say what I want?
When I say what I want is, I'm basically putting myself into the shoes of a typical coach that is working with an organization and has to deal with people on the very top that are, expecting results from the organization and wondering, everyone is busy, but when are we going to get something? Like, how will I see whether we get better or not? And I'm trying to connect their agenda with the agenda of the developers, people who are actually doing the work. And that's so this question, what are the results of our work, is basically where our Americans say it, where the rubber hits the road. It's kind of the point where every conversation becomes fruitful in an organization.
If I put now my technology hat on, I'm thinking that one of the problems with not slicing work vertically is a break in the abstraction level of work. So, if I think about object-oriented programming, I want to think that the team is the object, right? So the team is the unit of productivity. And they can break stuff down as much as they want, however they want inside the team. But I do not want to give a team a horizontal slice of work, because that means that team is now not productive anymore, right? They can be successful, yet I can fail to get what I want. So is that what you're talking about? Like finding the right level of abstraction for vertical slices, and then in those levels of abstraction, let's say a team only talk about vertical slices?
I would completely agree. So the on the level of the organization, I want to have a lot of vertical slices, and I want the teams to discuss how they will deliver it, and for that they can break them down as further and do whatever is needed for them to collaborate and organize themselves around delivering this vertical slice. But having those vertical slices, in my experience, most organizations don't have them. So when I talk to to project leaders, when we actually discuss this question, so when are you going to see some result that is actually going to reduce some risk or deliver value? Very often, most projects have 1 or 2 deliverable dates, and those are like 2 years in a row. So they do Scrum. They think they do Scrum. But the moment when they actually going to learn something is in 2 years, and very often what they learn is, well, something that they could have learned after 2 weeks, that something isn't working. And and I guess since you've been in the business for long enough, the risk compounds over time, and the readiness to speak about it, to get this feedback is actually gets lower and lower until everyone is afraid, but then the deadline is hit.
So this actually brings me to the second topic that I wanted to approach. We haven't talked about it, but one aspect of vertical slicing is that it actually gives us the power to manipulate and manage the dependencies, right? Like the moment when we start organizing work horizontally, we actually create more dependencies, and we create potentials for failure to deliver, right? Like if it's very simple to understand that if one team is fully responsible for delivering something, then that's one level of complexity. But if you now have multiple teams that need to all deliver in order for something to be delivered, that's what horizontal slices are, then of course you increase the complexity many times, right? Because, anything can happen when you add more than one team, and you need to manage that. And for me, one of the things that you now pointed to is also that if what we want is predictability, then the obvious choice is to work much more with vertical slices.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're completely right. When we work with multiple teams, we typically even may require, like if we as a team are responsible for delivering this one dish and we don't know anything about working with meat, and we have this other person who is responsible for cutting the meat and who is in this other team, but everything else about the dish is actually in our competency. That's why we've taken on to prepare this dish to keep this whole dinner metaphor alive. Even though we may depend on the other team, we're still focused on our result. So managing dependencies becomes basically communicating with this one guy who can help us cut our meat. However, instead, if we organized our work horizontally, and if we said, well, you do everything with the vegetables, and you do everything with the meat, and then there is obviously immediately there is a requirement for someone above all the teams to coordinate and to think, oh, how does this meat work with this vegetable work, and who is going to be responsible for putting that together? Oh, I think we need an integration team, and yada yada yada, and suddenly all those structures and hierarchy levels and confusion creates. So one of the main the main things that happen when you actually start thinking about vertical slices and delivering results, it actually simplifies a lot of things in your organization.
And when you think about it, of course, then it starts to become an important question to address, which is, okay, so why aren't organizations working with vertical slices. So in your experience, what prevents organizations, managers, and even teams from taking advantage of the concept of vertical slices and being mindful and deliberate about how they slice work?
So I really hope to change that exactly with my book, because actually I believe the main thing why people are not doing that is habit. When you are an expert at something and you know that, for example, preparing a dish again is going to take 8 hours because it's a long one, it's a big one, and I ask you, well, but what can you deliver in 2 hours? Because this is the length of our sprint, of our iteration. My typical answer would be, well, in 2 hours is, and then I'm going to tell you a couple of steps that I will have made to deliver this dish. It's not going to be something useful. So, and then the question arises, well, who will question what this expert is saying, how he divided his work, right? And most organizations, they don't understand that there is this 2 ways of breaking up work, and this is just not conscious knowledge. And I hope by bringing a lot more consciousness to this particular, it's actually a very small and basic question, there can be a big change in this approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I also noticed that, of course, I'm a project manager from background. I still call myself a recovering project manager. And I noticed that a lot of the things we are taught when we become project managers is exactly the horizontal breaking of work, right? Like in project management, we talk about work breakdown structures. And work breakdown structures are very usually hierarchies of work tasks. And, in project management, it goes to the level of assigning a task to an individual. I mean, it can go, it doesn't need to go, but that's what we usually see out there in the field. And that mindset also prevents us from understanding the idea of the potentially shippable, which is what Scrum introduced, of course, in its even in its original language, right? Potentially shippable increment. And in software, though, it is extremely easy to do this, to create a potentially shippable increment. It just requires a change of mindset, because the software itself is amenable, it's flexible to implementing this idea. So focusing on the software here for a little bit, Anton, because software is different from cooking or construction or building a bridge or whatever it is. What do you see prevents people with knowledge of software from seeing the benefit of stepping out of the horizontal slicing and stepping into a lot more vertical and potentially shippable increment slicing?
That's a very good question. So I would still say that a little bit habit is still playing a role. So there is, like, if you're listening to this, if you're interested in doing this for software, there's a lot of stuff that Alistair Cockburn has developed. Actually, this elephant carpaccio exercise, something you can do immediately with your teams, or the walking skeleton approach. So there are things you can learn, but most of the time, in my experience, when I work with software development organizations, what prevents them from slicing vertically is actually developers who even though they're dealing with software, but they're writing software not in a manner that it is actually allowing them to be flexible. So the way they write it, if I tell them, well, let's start with one little slice, and the second slice may actually give us some new knowledge, and we may question what we've done in the first one. Basically, what they realize is they would have to throw away everything that they've written in the as code in the first slice. So for them, it would be they would have to completely redo what they've done. But when they actually become experts in programming, they learn skills like clean code or test-driven development and more of such technical excellence topics. They become masters in creating code that is as flexible as you just said, and that allows them actually to learn and not throw away most of the code that they've written in the first place.
Yeah, when I think about it, so the metaphor I usually use is the tracer bullet idea, right? You send a tracer bullet through the architecture, meaning you implement a very thin vertical slice of the whole architecture. In the book that we published recently here at Oikosofi, the How to Succeed with Agile Business Intelligence. We talk about this concept of delivering a proof of concept in less than a day, right? Like, how do you show value in less than a day so that you get feedback and then you move on? And this ability to do this tracer bullet metaphor requires us to think of architecture as something flexible. And I can't help but thinking that, okay, at least when I went through university, the first thing you learned as a software engineer is that first you design the architecture. And in software, as practitioners, we now know that's the wrong way around. Yes, you can have a high level idea of the architecture, and that's, productive and useful. But the moment you start to ossify that architecture, you lose all flexibility. And then, as I usually say, the software starts managing you instead of you managing software. So I think it's really important, the message that you just gave us, that when developers learn to use techniques that allow this flexibility, like DDD, for example, and other extreme programming practices, then we can extract that flexibility from the software. But we can also, especially if we think about it horizontally, we can also build some unintended decisions into the architecture and then get stuck with it. And that's what in Scrum we talk about the rotten core, right? Like when the architecture no longer serves what we need it to serve.
Yeah, that's why architectures and good designs emerge from from collaborating teams,
and they continuously emerge. Like it's not something that you can say, oh, in the first 30% of the project we will get the architecture. Yes, you will get the main concepts, but it will need to evolve, of course. So when you think about applying this in practice, like all of the things that we talked about, and of course we also just now talked about the necessary software development practices that might help with the slicing. But in your experience, when working with teams and organizations, what is the hardest part of applying the techniques that you talk about in the book?
So understanding that and practicing it actually takes, a couple of iterations, and then a person is typically into it. The largest resistance that I experience is with people feeling empowered. Once they realize, oh, this is what it would look like if we actually sliced our projects, our endeavors vertically, they realize, oh, well, but that means we would have to have a completely different structure of what we do. The teams that we have right now, they don't make any sense. And then very often there is this, oh, but then it doesn't make sense. Why would I do that? If I'm not empowered to change the structure, why would I do that? And that is actually a resistance that in my experience, people underestimate themselves. In most organizations, when people don't know that they can deliver something in 20 little steps, they will never they will never see that. If the only thing that I see is this one step or two steps of my whole project, I don't have options. But even if you are not empowered to change the structure, but you come to me and you tell me, well, we can deliver the whole thing, and then we can, in the end, see whether it worked or not. Or we can have this 20 steps that I've figured out we could take. What do you think is a better approach? If you're even able to present someone with the options, that is very often the game changer. So in conversations with management, with people who are empowered to change structure, knowing that there are options is typically the game changer. And even if they do not agree to change the structure, you keep your sanity. You know what counts. And that is already a lot.
So let's take that further, right? Because once you realize that, then of course the question is, okay, but how do I present this to leaders in the organization? Because they often come to me and say, but we already know what to do. Why should we now start slicing work in a different way?
Right. So obviously it depends on what is your relationship with the leaders. But in the case that is, I would say, with the least amount of relationship, what I typically do is I do not talk about the slicing. I talk about the risks. I typically ask leaders to think about the project especially if they experienced such a project before or such an endeavor before, and ask them to basically collect, maybe for 5 minutes or something on stickies or on a Miro board, to collect what they think can go wrong. Like, imagine this project is done in 2 years and a lot of things have gone wrong. What has gone wrong? Let's collect everything. And then once we collect those risks, we kind of look into what could be a result that de-risks this particular risk. And suddenly we are on the same page. Suddenly, I'm not talking about slicing. We are talking about risk management, but actually real risk management, how to diffuse risks one after the other while delivering the whole project. Very often, this would be kind of the easiest approach that I know of with top management.
So actually, this is a very good point, and one I agree with. I think that talking about risk management leads naturally to think about slices, at least slices in what relates to de-risking or removing risks from the project. And one of the things that I often talk about when I talk about slicing is this: we are paying to get information that is critical for us, and removing a risk is very important information, because we might discover it's not possible to remove, then we need a workaround, right? And then also finding things that are not clear yet. Like, for example, we don't know if we should follow architecture A or architecture B. So one way to tackle that question is to have a never-ending discussion, invite a few architects, write a few architecture documents, take a long time, have a lot of discussions about which architecture to approve. Another way is to spend one day implementing one architecture, another day implementing the other architecture, with that tracer bullet metaphor, and figuring out which one feels like it would suit us, right? Because I think that one of the key things, and Woody Zuil often says this, is it's in the doing of the work that we actually find out what work needs to be done. And that discovery, that unveiling of information, is very important for us to then make future decisions.
Absolutely. And you will only do enough of this work if you try to deliver something that someone else from outside can actually see and try out. That's a very good kind of point of learning for yourself. Even if you are just a developer and you think, well, I don't care for all the business things, but when will you know that you've actually discovered enough? Like you say, from your work. Well, when whatever you've done actually does a little bit, like answers the API with the right response, or whatever it is that the product that you're building.
So let's take a little bit of a futuristic approach now. Let's imagine that you work with a few organizations and they've started adopting these slicing work techniques that you discuss in the book, The Art of Slicing Work. And they've just tuned that all the way up to 11. They're really doing all of those things. In your mind and in this vision of the future, how would work change for those teams and that organization?
Right. So, okay, that's a very beautiful picture. First of all, in this future, stakeholders and teams are always focused on the same thing, and they very frequently see results, and they very frequently discuss them and learn. And because of that, there is way less micromanagement. And micromanagement is actually not needed, because people see that teams learn from their results very, very fast. And that means teams have complete responsibility for what they do. This shift of responsibility towards teams is very clear and very pragmatic. It's not a theoretical thing. It's not because people are ideologically thinking that teams should be responsible. No, it's they know that this is what makes sense, because they see the results that come from the teams. The discussions that people have are very, very pragmatic. They're very short because they are focused on the results that should come. And because all those results are shown so frequently, there is a lot of trust in the whole organization and in the work process. And much fewer things are unseen. Actually, almost nothing is unseen. Like, everything is very transparent about how it works. And through this, typically, there is way fewer roles required. People are not discussing the question of roles that much. People are not discussing the frameworks that much, because they discuss the results and what results are next to be delivered and what is useful for that. Typically, there is much less hierarchy involved in this future, way fewer structures and way less coordination. That's kind of
I think
the
that's
beautiful picture.
It is definitely a beautiful picture. And I have to say, after reading a bit of your book and also having this conversation, it tempts me to add one more practice to the two practices I bring to every team. Usually I say, retrospectives and time boxes. That's all we need. Everything else will emerge because we will need to learn and whatever is needed will come up. But maybe after this conversation, I feel tempted to add a third practice, which is slice work vertically.
Thank you. That honors me a lot.
So the book is The Art of Slicing Work, How to Navigate Unpredictable Projects by Anton Skornyakov, and you can find it in the usual outlets. But Anton, for people who want to get in touch with you and want to know more about the work that you're doing, where can they find you?
Slicingwork.com. It's also easy to remember website. Yeah. There you can find me and everything on the book.
Absolutely. So slicingwork.com. The link will be on the show notes as usual. Anton, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you, Vasko. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.